The morning I found two strangers tearing apart a bench where children waited for the school bus. I thought I was watching the strangest overreaction I had ever seen in my neighborhood, but I had no idea that little wooden bench was about to expose a much bigger fight happening right under everyone's nose. My name is Daniel Harper, and for 12 years I lived in a quiet little town called Willow Creek, a place where people knew each other's dogs, waved from their porches, and complained about the weather like it was a full-time job. My house sat right at the edge of a neighborhood called Maple Ridge Estates, just outside their official entrance marker, which meant I wasn't part of their HOA, never attended their meetings, never paid their dues, and honestly never cared much about their rules. I had always believed that if people wanted to argue about mailbox colors and lawn decorations, that was their business, as long as they stayed on their side of the fence and I stayed on mine. But one cold Tuesday morning in late February, that invisible line between us disappeared. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing out my old coffee mug, when I noticed a white utility truck parked near the stop sign by my driveway. At first, I thought maybe the city was fixing something, because around here, a surprise road crew was usually followed by a surprise bill somewhere down the line. I looked closer and saw two men wearing bright reflective vests kneeling beside the small wooden bench that had been sitting there for years. They weren't repairing it, they were removing it. They had already taken off one side panel and were working on the bolts holding it to the concrete. That bench wasn't fancy. It wasn't some expensive piece of neighborhood furniture. It was just a simple green wooden seat, slightly faded from years of rain and snow, but everyone knew it. Every morning, kids from the surrounding streets sat there waiting for the school bus, their backpacks resting beside them, their little faces buried in scarves and winter coats, laughing and talking while parents watched from the sidewalks. I walked outside into the freezing air and called out, "Hey, can I ask what you're doing?" One of the workers looked up for half a second, then went right back to his tools. "Removing the bench," he said. I laughed a little because I honestly thought he was joking. "Yeah, I can see that. I mean, why?" He shrugged. "HOA order. They said it's not permitted anymore." I remember standing there thinking, did I hear that right? The HOA? This same HOA that didn't even own my property? I pointed toward my house and said, "You do realize I don't live inside Maple Ridge, right?" The other guy finally looked at me and gave me the kind of expression people give when they already know the answer doesn't matter. "We're just following instructions." That sentence always bothers me. I've heard it in a lot of situations where nobody wants to take responsibility. We're just following instructions. The bench was gone by Saturday. No announcement. No conversation with the parents. No explanation. Just four metal bolts sticking out of the concrete where something useful and familiar used to be. And I'll admit, at first I tried to let it go. I told myself maybe there was a reason. Maybe there was some safety issue I didn't know about. Maybe someone complained. But then I started noticing things. Parents who used to sit comfortably nearby now stood closer to the road with their kids. Older neighbors shook their heads and said it felt wrong. One mother told me, "Daniel, that bench was there before half those houses were even built." I didn't know what to say because she was right. It wasn't just a bench anymore. It had become part of the rhythm of the neighborhood. Then, about a week later, everything changed. I woke up before sunrise to a sound that didn't belong in our quiet streets. Deep diesel engines. Heavy equipment. The kind of noise that makes your windows shake before your brain even understands what you're hearing. I stepped outside and saw massive orange trucks rolling through the neighborhood. Their tires covered in mud, their engines growling as they turned the same corner where the bus stop used to be. That's when I started wondering if the bench had never really been the problem at all. Because suddenly, the empty space where that little green seat once stood looked less like a cleanup project and more like a cleared path. The next few days felt different. Like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say something out loud. Every morning, those trucks came through earlier and earlier. Around 5:30, sometimes before the sun was even up, I would hear the rumble of engines, the sharp beeping of heavy equipment backing up, and the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires. I started drinking my coffee outside just to watch what was happening. And honestly, I never thought I would become the guy standing in his driveway studying construction trucks like some kind of amateur detective. But something about it bothered me. It wasn't just the noise. It was the timing. The bench disappeared, and suddenly there was room for a steady stream of giant trucks to move through. That was when the questions started. Where were they going? Who approved this? And why did nobody tell the people who lived here? The rumors spread quickly. Someone said there was a new development being planned behind Maple Ridge Estates. Another person said the HOA had been working with a private contractor for months. Nobody had the full story, but everyone seemed to know one thing. Those trucks were not there by accident. I decided I needed answers, and I figured the best place to start was City Hall. Now, I have to admit, walking into a government office asking questions about a neighborhood dispute isn't exactly how I imagined spending my Wednesday morning. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't trying to become some local hero. I just wanted to know why a group of people who didn't even represent me had removed something from public space and suddenly allowed a highway's worth of construction traffic through our streets. I walked into the records office and explained what I was looking for. The clerk, a woman named Susan, looked at me over her glasses and asked, "Are you part of Maple Ridge Estates?" I smiled and said, "No." And apparently that's part of the problem. She gave me a small look, like she had already heard a few complaints about the project. She disappeared into the back room and came back carrying a thick manila folder. She placed it on the counter and said, "You might want to take a look at this." Inside was the construction permit, along with maps showing the approved access route for the project. I unfolded the papers, expecting to find some complicated explanation, maybe something buried in legal language that would make me feel embarrassed for questioning it. But instead, I saw a simple red line running across the map. The route went directly through Maple Ridge's main road, around the exact corner where the bus stop had been. I stared at that line for a long time, because suddenly everything made sense. The bench wasn't removed because it looked messy. It wasn't removed because it didn't match some neighborhood aesthetic. It wasn't about appearances at all. The bench had been standing in the way. It was sitting right where construction vehicles needed more space to turn. They didn't remove a piece of furniture. They removed an obstacle. And that was the moment I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't angry because someone moved a bench. I was angry because people had been treated like they were too small to matter. The parents weren't informed. The kids weren't considered. The people living along that road were simply expected to accept whatever decision was made behind closed doors. I printed every page of that permit. I highlighted the truck route in bright red and started knocking on doors. Some people were skeptical at first. One neighbor opened his door, looked at the papers in my hand, and said, "Daniel, don't tell me you're fighting the HOA over a bench." I laughed because, honestly, it sounded ridiculous even to me. "That's what they want everyone to think," I said. "They want this to be about a bench. It's not about the bench." Slowly, people started reading the documents. Then they started asking their own questions. One mother named Rachel, whose son had almost been hit by one of those trucks, watched the video from her phone and went completely silent. She looked at me and said, "They knew those trucks were coming through here?" I nodded. "Looks like it." Her expression changed from confusion to anger. "And they removed the one thing where kids were safely sitting?" That was the moment the story stopped being just my concern. It became everyone's. Rachel contacted the local newspaper. Another parent started recording the trucks every morning. Neighbors began collecting dates, times, and videos. The same people who had been ignored suddenly had evidence, and evidence has a funny way of changing the conversation. Within days, a reporter from Channel 8 showed up with a camera crew. They interviewed parents, residents, and even filmed the exact corner where the near accident happened. When the footage aired that evening, everything changed. People who had never heard about Maple Ridge Estates were suddenly talking about it. The story wasn't HOA removes old bench. The story was neighborhood construction route approved without proper safety concerns. The phone calls started coming in. City officials started asking questions. And the HOA board, the same people who had confidently ordered that bench removed, suddenly found themselves trying to explain why nobody had been told what was happening. For the first time, they weren't controlling the story anymore. The next morning, I received a message from one of the HOA board members asking if we could have a conversation. I knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't an invitation, it was damage control. I agreed to meet because I wanted to hear what they had to say. When I arrived at the community office, the same people who once acted like the neighborhood belonged only to them were now sitting across the table looking uncomfortable. The HOA president, a man named Richard Cole, folded his hands and said, "Daniel, I think this situation has gotten blown out of proportion." I looked at him and asked, "A child almost got hit by a construction truck. How exactly is that blown out of proportion?" He leaned back and said, "The bench was a safety concern. The street needed to be clear." I slid the permit papers across the table. Funny, the street only needed to be clear after the construction contract was approved. Nobody spoke for a few seconds, and in that silence, I realized something important. They weren't upset because people were angry. They were upset because people finally understood what had happened. The meeting with Richard Cole and the HOA board lasted less than 30 minutes. But when I walked out of that office, I knew something had changed. Not because I had won some huge victory, not because anyone stood up and admitted they were wrong, but because for the first time since this whole thing started, the people who had been making decisions in private were finally being forced to answer questions in public. A month earlier, they were completely comfortable. They believed the situation was simple: remove the bench, clear the road, move forward with construction, and eventually everyone would forget about it. And maybe that's what bothered me the most. They didn't think they were hurting anyone because they never stopped to look at who was standing on the other side of their decisions. They saw a wooden bench. We saw a place where children started their mornings. They saw a construction route. We saw a street where families lived. They saw paperwork. We saw people. Richard continued to insist that the HOA had acted responsibly. He said the bench was an obstruction, that the road needed to be accessible, and that the development project would bring benefits to the area. But every time he talked about the future of the neighborhood, I noticed something. He never mentioned the kids who waited there every morning, the parents who trusted that corner was safe, or the residents who had to wake up before sunrise because giant trucks were suddenly passing their homes. I finally leaned forward and asked him, "Richard, if this was really about safety, why didn't anyone talk to the families first?" The room went quiet. He looked uncomfortable for the first time. He adjusted the papers in front of him and said, "Not every decision requires a community vote." And that sentence told me more than anything else he could have said, because sometimes people reveal exactly how they see others when they think they're in control. To him, this was a management issue, a scheduling issue, a property issue. But to everyone else, it was about trust. And trust is one of those things you don't notice when you have it, but you feel it immediately when it's gone. After the meeting, I expected the fight to continue for months. I thought there would be lawyers, arguments, endless paperwork, maybe even a long battle between residents and the HOA. But the next morning, everything moved faster than anyone expected. The city announced that officials had reviewed the construction permits, the traffic concerns, and the videos showing the dangerous conditions near the bus stop. They issued a temporary order preventing construction vehicles from using the residential streets until additional safety measures were put in place. The reaction was immediate. The same streets that had been filled with the sound of diesel engines suddenly became quiet again. No more trucks shaking windows before sunrise. No more parents pulling their children closer every time a giant vehicle turned the corner. No more people standing outside wondering who had decided their concerns didn't matter. I remember that first quiet morning. I walked outside with my coffee and just stood there for a minute. It was strange how peaceful everything felt. I could hear birds again. I could hear neighbors talking. I could hear kids laughing. And honestly, after weeks of chaos, those normal sounds felt almost unbelievable. But the biggest surprise came about a week later. I was driving past the old bus stop when I saw something sitting there that made me slow down. The bench was back. At first, I thought maybe someone had placed a temporary seat there, but when I got closer, I realized it was the same bench, repaired, reinforced, painted a fresh shade of green. It looked almost exactly like it had years earlier, before anyone decided it was a problem. I got out of my truck and walked over. The paint was still slightly rough under my fingertips. You could still smell the fresh wood and coating. It wasn't some grand monument. It wasn't expensive. But standing there, I realized that little bench had become something much bigger than itself. A few minutes later, the kids started arriving for the bus. Their backpacks bounced as they walked. Some of them immediately sat down. Others stood around laughing and talking like nothing had ever happened. Rachel's son, the same boy who had stepped too close to the road that morning with the truck coming toward him, looked at the bench and smiled. "They fixed it," he said. I nodded. "Yeah, they did." Then he sat down like it had always belonged there. And maybe that's the part that stayed with me the most. Kids don't care about HOA meetings. They don't care about permits or contracts or who has the biggest office. They just know when something feels normal and when something feels wrong. They knew that bench belonged there. The parents knew it. The neighbors knew it. The only people who seemed confused were the ones who never bothered to ask. Looking back now, I still think about how close this whole thing came to being forgotten. If nobody had questioned the bench, maybe nobody would have questioned the trucks. If nobody had looked at the permit, maybe nobody would have noticed the route. If nobody had spoken up, maybe everyone would have simply accepted that this was just how things worked. And that's the dangerous part about small decisions made without accountability. They rarely stay small. A single choice can reveal a bigger pattern. One person deciding they know what's best for everyone can create a conflict that affects an entire community. The funny thing is, when I first stepped outside that morning and saw those workers removing the bench, I wasn't angry. I was confused. I actually thought, really? This is what we're spending time on? I almost walked back inside. I almost ignored it. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had. Maybe the trucks would have kept coming. Maybe another close call would have happened. Maybe people would have just kept telling themselves it was normal. But someone had to ask one simple question. Why? And sometimes that's all it takes. Not a powerful position. Not a big title. Just someone willing to look at something that doesn't feel right and say, wait a minute, what's really going on here? Today, when I drive past that corner and see the green bench sitting there, it doesn't remind me of a fight with an HOA. It reminds me of something much simpler. It reminds me that communities aren't built by rules alone. They're built by the small things people care about, the places where kids wait for buses, the sidewalks where neighbors say hello, the corners where ordinary moments happen every single day. But even now, years later, people still argue about what happened. Some believe the HOA was unfair and tried to push through a project without caring about residents. Others believe the board was simply trying to manage growth, and that the situation became bigger than it needed to be. And maybe that's why the story still gets people talking. Because the real question isn't just about a bench. It's about power. It's about responsibility. It's about whether leaders should make decisions for people or with people. So I want to know what you think. If you were in that neighborhood, would you have challenged the HOA? Or would you have trusted their explanation? Was removing the bench a practical decision? Or was it the first sign that something much bigger was happening behind closed doors? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share your perspective. And let's talk about where the line should be between progress and protecting the people who already call a place home. Because sometimes the smallest things we fight for are the things that prove a community is still worth fighting for.